outside down the street, particularly, segue back to the national security side.
Peter, what are you?
Well, I'm still working at the department. I'm working on a very nice integrative project for religious freedom for Kazakhstan.
You're probably safe on
Yeah,
that one.
no, I know, I'm worried more about my.
Yes, my name is Darian. I'm so
Sorry, just wanted to use it. Thank you all for coming. We're gonna get started now. Thank you to first the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College for lending us their space graciously to host one of many speaker events that we have planned for this spring, the spring series of panel events. So please keep yourself apprised, and we will do our best to keep you apprised of the next couple, actually. I would like to welcome all of you all who are here in person, but also those who are joining us online through YouTube. Hello, thank you. Camera's right there for anybody wondering. Yeah. So, the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, we are an international peace-building, violence prevention organization. We're trying to bridge the voices and concerns of faith actors, religious actors all around the world, internationally as well as domestically, and trying to see how we can lift their voices in coming up with durable, creative, sustainable solutions to conflict and violence. My name is Ray Kim, the Director of U.S. Programs and Partnerships here, and I am so happy to see you all here and the imaginary faces that are online, probably. Couple of house cleaning stuff. If you need to use your restroom, it is right outside the door, and before you leave, please take the key card that is on the small desk on the left corner. You'll need that to kind of beep yourself back into the office because we can't prop that door open because it'll start screaming at us. Very secure facilities here. Food and beverages are available at any time, so please help yourself as you see fit. And then I think those are in terms of all the technical stuff, everything I need to cover. And then I'd be a poor employee of our organization if I didn't also take your time to ask for your support in keeping our organization's door open, especially in these tough times with a lot of the government funding restrictions. And we just recently, unfortunately, heard that our Syria program was terminated. And so we do have ongoing programs that are in dire need of replacement solutions and replacement support. You can use the QR code here, or you can go to www.icrd.org and then find your way to the gift section of the website. And we would welcome any financial support that you can give. And we do not treat your financial support as just you all simply throwing money at some problems around the world, but we will be very intentional in reaching out if you have any questions about the way we do our work, where our programs are, what we're accomplishing. We want to use your partnership with us as a relationship building tool and an opportunity. So we will not take that for granted. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my dear friend and colleague, Luke Nathan Phillips, who will do the introduction of our esteemed guests to my right. So Luke, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ray. First off, thank you all for being here and for taking a little bit of time out of your afternoon and evening to not only eat our food, but to learn about one of the most important topics of our time, something that I think has very recently become only the more acute and help us think through some of these things. First off, I'd like to thank the Eisenhower Institute at Gettysburg College. They are a policy and education center serving the students of Gettysburg College and the policy professional community here in Washington, D.C. They stand at the center of bipartisan civic and historical education and advocacy, which is a very unique spot to be in this city. And in the coming months and years, they will be continuing and deepening their work as a center of creative public service here in the nation's capital. The 21st century has seen, among other kinds of conflict, acute and increasing rates of violent extremism of all sorts. The United States has a history of this domestically in modern times, confronting the white supremacist violence directed against African Americans across the segregated South, anarchist violence directed against the federal government in the long aftermath of the Vietnam War, and right-wing militia violence directed against the federal government since at least the 1990s, among others. The attacks of September 11, 2001, and the subsequent attention paid to Al-Qaeda and other Islamist terrorist organizations shifted the focus of the national security community's countering violent extremism, or CVE, work overseas over the course of the 2000s. And in the years since, we have accumulated large amounts of scholarship and practical expertise on CVE work. The currents of this violence were rooted in long-running crises and struggles in the Islamic world over the long 20th century, and the people experiencing it most viscerally and frequently have been Muslims and often Christians and Jews in Muslim-majority countries across the Islamic world, and especially in the Middle East. Various Islamic and interfaith movements have spent decades addressing the social crises and disintegrations afflicting these societies, work done for its own sake that has had surprising insights for the long-term amelioration of the conditions in which ideological extremism arises. Meantime, the United States in the 2010s and 2020s has undergone increasing levels of domestic political violence and ideological radicalization across the political spectrum, but acutely on the right, as most indicators of social trust have diminished measurably over the past 3 decades, ever since Robert Putnam and Charles Murray wrote their pioneering works on social decline in modern America. The threat of domestic political violence hovers over our increasingly tumultuous times, and contemporary approaches to CVE work have shifted towards this, especially since the Biden administration's groundbreaking development of a national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. To help us think through these themes and their implications, we are graciously joined by 2 very thoughtful and insightful practitioners and scholars of these fields. Adam Garfinkle was the founding editor of the American Interest magazine, rest in peace, one of the best and most serious policy journals in DC during much of the time that we are discussing. He is a Middle East specialist who spent much of his career at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and on Capitol Hill, and served as a speechwriter for Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. In 2003, he published an edited volume on approaches to counter-terrorist work in the Middle East and has written extensively on the subject for policymakers in the national security community. Ibrahim Anli was the director of the Rumi Forum, is the director of the Rumi Forum, I apologize, a Washington, D.C.-based institute of the international Hizmet Movement, an interfaith community dedicated to promoting understanding across faith traditions and the long-term cause of social peace, and rooted, I understand, in many of the spiritual traditions of Sufi Islam. He has been a practitioner of Hizmet's approach to reconciliation and social entrepreneurship in the Middle East and the United States for decades. And he began his work in the United States after the events of 2016 in his home country of Turkey. My name is Luke Nathan Phillips, and I work with the ICRD on political polarization work. And in its various manifestations, those include the crises of social trust and polarization. I have spent my career in political polarization studies and reconciliation work, and I have been adjacent to the foreign policy community for much of that time as well. This conversation is first and foremost an outline of the best lines of thought in analyzing and approaching the contemporary threat of political violence and ideological radicalization in an age of visceral political polarization and social decay. If we have made the problems a little bit clearer and opened paths towards subsequent inquiry and activism, we will have succeeded by the end of this evening. We're going to have about an hour of conversation, and then we will open up the Q&A for 30 to 45 minutes. But in the meantime, Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luke. Never been to the Eisenhower Institute before. Nice to be here. I have warm feelings from my childhood for President Eisenhower and Mamie. Used to go to the Easter egg roll, you know, on the lawn of the White House. Can't do that anymore, I don't think. I was born right here in Washington. I was born under the Truman constellation, but pretty soon Dwight Eisenhower and Mamie were the only two, you know, president and first ladies that I knew when I was a kid. So whenever I think of them, it's a nice warm feeling. In 20 minutes, there is almost nothing coherent one can say about this very capacious subject. And so here is what I have done. I have brought a bunch of books. They're right over there. I think, if memory serves, that when I was teaching at the University of California, District of Columbia office, I think I taught a course on this kind of a subject, or maybe it was it wasn't in science. I don't remember where I taught it. But it took me 13 weeks, a whole semester, to say something coherent about what is a very complex subject. And in 20 minutes, I mean, it's almost demobilizing trying to say anything. So here I've got the books, right? There are a lot more books than this, but these are pretty good ones, okay? So you have your phones, right? If you're really interested in this subject and you're interested in the Middle East dimension of it rather than the American domestic dimension of it, about which I know it's not that much, just you take pictures of the books, right? You can open it up to the title, whatever, you know. You could take all the pictures you want and write down the sources if you don't have your camera, and you can really, you know, learn a lot from those books. And I have published some stuff on this, but not recently, as Luke mentioned. I haven't thought about the subject a whole lot lately, and one of the reasons is that the problem in the Middle East, right, as opposed to elsewhere, is not nearly as acute seeming as it was 15 years ago. At the time, I really thought a lot of the fears that Salafi terrorism could become an existential threat to the United States on the level of the Soviet Union. I thought that was a lot of horse flop. And it turns out that I was right. I mean, it just couldn't quite make it to the top rung, you know. So Islamic terrorism, Salafi terrorism, fundamentalism, there are lots of names for it. It still plagues many societies, but it certainly didn't rise to the level of an existential threat to this country, and it's not going to. So I've been doing other things, including retiring, right? That's why I don't have a tie on, right? There's a rule, okay? Unless you're going to a religious service, a wedding, or a funeral, if you're retired, you don't have to wear a suit and tie. So I don't see anybody here getting married or dying, right? And this is not, we're not going to pray. So I don't have a tie on. So I hope you aren't offended by that. Let me start by telling you a story. So as Luke said, I was a speechwriter to Colin Powell for a couple of years. I know what you're going to say. No, I did not write the Security Council speech in February 2003, but I know who did. I really enjoyed working for Secretary Powell. And I was the Schedule B hire. Some of you have worked for the government probably because you're here in Washington, right? You know what a Schedule B hire is? I bet you most of you don't know. A Schedule A hire is the regular government, it's the civil service, foreign service. And you all know what a Schedule C hire is, right? That's the plum prune book, right? That's political appointment. So if in the foreign policy domain, if A is foreign service, civil service, and C is political, what's B? What's B? B is called an expert hire. What is an expert hire? Somebody has to determine that in government employment, there's a function that a cabinet officer, cabinet member needs that can't be supplied from the line bureaucracies. So you have to go outside the government to pull in this particular expert. And if you do that, all right, you have to, that lets the person who's a Schedule B hire get beyond the GS 15 step 3 pay scale. You all know what that is, right? Or if you don't, just ask somebody else. So I was a Schedule B hire. And so the Chief of Staff, Larry Wilkerson, took me aside to fill out some papers so I could get hired. This was in the summer of 2003. A joyous time, right? A couple of months after the start of the Iraq War. And so Larry asked me, well, Adam, what is your expertise? I thought for a minute and I said, Larry, I can read and write the English language. And he wrote it down. And of course, nobody reads these papers, all right? And the moral of the story is that if a Secretary of State wants to hire you, even if you're not a Republican, and I wasn't, and I never have been, and I never will be, if a Secretary of State wants to hire you, he can. So I stayed with Secretary Powell until the end of the first Bush 43 administration, and then I stayed on. I'm not talking about terrorism at all, but I'll get there in a minute, maybe. Just to work with Condi. We all thought we were going to get fired because that's just the pattern. You know, secretaries bring their own speechwriters. But Condi couldn't bring her own speechwriter because she was coming from the NSC from the White House. You can't steal the president's speechwriters; just can't do that. So she kept us all, and I wrote her first two major speeches. The first one was in Europe at Sciences Po. We were trying to make nice with the Europeans because had a little falling out over the Iraq War. And then the second one was in Asia at Sophia University in Tokyo. And those speeches went over pretty well, all things considered, given the circumstances. The third speech, however, was scheduled for Cairo. And this was going to be Condi channeling President Bush's forward strategy for freedom policy. Some of you are too young to even remember that, but that's good for you. And I resigned. I could not make my hand write the kinds of things that Condi needed or wanted to say in Cairo. And so I left, and a person that I helped bring into the speechwriting shop wrote that speech for her and wrote all the rest of her speeches. People right now in this town, a lot of people are in a really tight spot. Take the people who work for the radios, what's left of them. Take the people who work for the National Endowment for Democracy. Take the people who work for USAID and other places I shouldn't have to mention. A lot of these people, managers, people fairly high up in these organizations, are a very tight spot right now. You can imagine the circumstances where someone would say, well, you know, I'm the last line of defense for these 2,000, 3,000 employees that I'm protecting. After a certain point, though, you're no longer the last line of defense. You are complicit in what is happening to them. When does that line get crossed, right? It's a very, very tough place to be. So I experienced that in a very minor way, and my decision was to just leave because I couldn't write those. So let me tell you very briefly what the problem was. After 9/11, the Bush administration and the American intellectual, you know, the blogosphere, the foreign policy blogosphere, in general, splits into two forms of idealism, two shards of idealism. People on the left thought that the root causes of Salafi terrorism that caused 9/11 were the usual causes of everything that went wrong. It was poverty, and it was social injustice. So if you could somehow fix those things, then the motivations for Salafi terrorism would decrease and disappear. On the right, on the other hand, a different, just as idealistic point of view held pride of place, and that was the democracy deficit theory. In other words, these people were frustrated because their political status did not match their rising economic and social status in their modernizing countries, and they had no channel for expressing themselves. They had no political agency, and so in frustration and not being able to organize in authoritarian political cultures, they turned to violence, right? And this was so both of these metaphors were Cold War metaphors. The poverty and social grievance explanation or template or analogy, you know, that's what started the Peace Corps. That's what started USAID in the first place. This idea that communism thrives on discontent and unfairness, right? And meanwhile, on the right, the democracy deficit idea, I mean, that's just part of the, you know, the DNA of the peace theory. That if everybody would just become democracies, we wouldn't have war anymore, and everything would be terrific to become just like us, you know, and the world would be a happy place. So these are both Cold War metaphors, and neither one of them had anything to do with the Middle East. Nothing. Neither one of these analogies fit the actual problem. The actual problem was blocked modernization, and that's what most of these books are about. You had pressures from outside, Westernization on Middle Eastern societies, Arabs and others. And you had internal changes. For example, you had greater female literacy. You had lowering birth rates. You had urbanization. I mean, this is just sort of basic standard sociology of modernization. And that is really, that was the underlying source of the tension. And what happened was most of these societies kind of broke into three pieces when they were confronted with these pressures, some internal, some external. There were the modernizers, and this goes back to, you know, the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1799. For God's sake, it's been going on for a while. This tug of war, it's just accelerated with technology and a closening globe. So one of the three sort of general approaches to this kind of pressure on traditional society, endogamous marriage, kind of tribal structure societies. That's more true of some places in the Middle East than others, but it's somewhat true of all of them. When you so one response was, let's be like the Westerners, right? Let's modernize like the Westerners. They're wealthy, they're powerful, you know, they smile from time to time. They don't, you know, let's be like them. Let's leave our hidebound traditions behind. Then you have the opposite. You have the nativists who feel that the corporate identity of their very society and civilization is at risk. And so what they do is they use religious symbols to mobilize opposition, not just to the foreigners, but to those people in their own countries with whom they disagree about the response to the pressures of modernization. And then you have sort of like the third way, Tony Blair way. It's a little bit like Hizmet, I think. Let's try to find a response to modernization that we can modernize, but we do it within the logical grammar of our own culture. So there's a difference between modernization and westernization, right? And a lot of movements in the Middle East have tried to sort of find the way to move their societies forward, right, without betraying their fundamental religious traditions, all right? And in that struggle, as I say, which has been going on for a long time, in 9/11 and in other terrorist attacks in the West, France and other places, Danish cartoon, all this stuff, right? This is an internal struggle in different countries among these three factions of how to respond to the pressures of modernization. And the United States and the French, we are props. We're not the main target. We are props. We are the further enemy, but it's the near enemy, right, that Al-Qaeda and these other groups have really been focused on. We were just the props. Now, it mattered a great deal that the Bush administration and others, not just the Bush administration, I'm not picking, when I work for it, right? I'm not picking on it. It matters that people misunderstood this so fundamentally because we did things that were completely counterproductive. You see, in Arab countries in particular, now they're not all the same, obviously, but in Arab countries, the social structure and religion are interwoven, all right? So the social structure precedes Islam. The problem is not Islam, all right? That was also a canard you heard a lot. Oh, Islam is a bloody religion. That's a bunch of horse flop. It's not about Islam. It's about things that are much more complex than in the books. If you attack the social structure, if you push against the Hams, the 5-generational patriarchal identity template that people focus on in that part of the world, since religion supports it, if you attack the social structure, you're attacking religion. If you attack religion, you're attacking the social structure. They're kind of the same thing for many practical purposes. So what did we do? So by saying, we're going to democratize 21 Arab countries, that's what the forward strategy for freedom was about, right? Even though the attitudinal predicates of individual agency and the idea of a loyal opposition, none of those things existed in these societies, right? So it was just silly. It's like trying to tie a camel to a luggage rack, and you can't do it. It won't stay up there for very long. So what we actually did was we played right into the hands of the nativists who were hijacking political symbols for their own domestic purposes. So look at the Americans, right? They're coming here. They're trying to make you be Democrats. And Abu Musa al-Zarqawi, if you remember his name, he was the Iraqi rabble-rouser, no longer among the living, who claimed before the first, remember the Purple Thumb election in Iraq? I mean, I was in the government at the time, so I remember these things, right? I was paying attention because I was getting paid to. He said, if you participate in this election that the Americans have set up, that is heresy, because democracy is a Christian ritual, all right? And that's nuts, right? That's nuts. But a lot of people, traditional people in Iraq, believe that. And why not? Because as Bernard Lewis once pointed out, there's a Bernard Lewis book up here somewhere, in the West, in the secularized West, countries have religions. But in the Middle East, religions have countries. Subtle difference, pretty important difference. So if you attack someone, if you say, we have universal best practice, and that's liberal democracy and market economics, right? And if you don't have those things, something's wrong with you, right? You're socially diseased. You talk to people like that, condescendingly down your nose at other cultures that you don't understand, whose languages you don't know, whose history you don't know, they're not going to take it well. And again, it feeds right into all the wrong types. And I could go on and on telling you about all the dumb things. I mean, sticking an American army into the heart of the Middle East, that was pretty dumb. That actually created more terrorists than it ever killed. And most of the Salafi groups that still exist, in Somalia, the franchises, even in Syria, all of that stuff really, ISIS, all of that stuff stems from sending an American army into the heart of the Middle East with not a lot of good guidance on what it should do once it got there. So when the Intifada, when the uprising, the Iraqi civil strike, when that arose a couple of months after the end of the Saddam Hussein regime, there was no plan in the government for what to do about it. I was in the government, I know. Kind of crazy stuff happened. I'll just give you one more little example of like my life, back then, and then I'll sit down because I said we can't really do anything about this. So I'm sitting in my office on the 7th floor of the State Department, room 7311. Policy planning, speechwriters are usually bivouac with policy planning in the State Department. And I'm listening to a speech the president is giving over the radio. This was over the radio. And it was, I think David Frum wrote it, or maybe Mike Gerson wrote it, I don't remember, but because we all knew each other. Speechwriters know each other, right? The dark arts of speechwriting, Peggy Noonan called it. We all know each other. And we don't care for Republicans or Democrats because it's like lawyers, right? You're trying to do the best job you can for your client. You don't have to believe all this stuff, but you just have to do your job, right? So I'm listening to President Bush, and he makes this sort of like extravagant reference to the House of Abraham. Of course, this is sort of ecumenical balderdash, the idea that Semites are all cousins and Arabs and Jews, and it's all Abrahamic, and we should just love each other. And can't we all just get along? Said Jack Nicholson, remember? And I'm thinking to myself, what's wrong with this? Something doesn't sound right, right? The House of Abraham, what does that mean? And finally it dawned on me after a cup of coffee and scratching my head for a couple of minutes. Abraham didn't have a house; he had a tent. So I'm thinking about how this translates into the languages of the region. Beit Ibrahim, Beit Avraham in Hebrew, Beit Ibrahim in Arabic, and I'm thinking, what would a Muslim, a Sunni Muslim in particular, if a Sunni Muslim heard the phrase in translation, these speeches translate, right? Beit Ibrahim, what would that mean to them, right? I wasn't sure, so I asked around. It would probably mean the Kaaba stone in Saudi Arabia, because that's where in Sunni Islamic thinking, that's where the binding of Isaac, Ishmael, in the Muslim, that's where it took place, in the Valley of Arafat, in the Hejaz, in Saudi Arabia. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, right? So I told Secretary Powell and other people that we got to do something about it. We need somebody in the State Department or somewhere in the government, someplace, that understands the political vocabulary of Islam, so that we know how things are going to sound to people in the region when they end up there in translation. And so what happens? So I think somebody sent me down to talk to David Satterfield. David Satterfield used to be our ambassador to Lebanon. He was sitting down on the 6th floor in NEA, and he knows a lot about this stuff. So I went down to David and I said, who do we have here who could do this for us? Somebody in INR, maybe, Intelligence and Research? He said, no, we have this one guy. He's the DCM in our embassy in Tunis right now. He has a PhD in this stuff. He's really great. I said, what the hell is he doing in Tunis? He needs to be here helping out so that we don't say these silly things and be misunderstood, in front of 130 million people. And so that the State Department had a lot of, they didn't know what to do with it. So I complained about it. I didn't complain. I said, we really need somebody to do this function. So Powell said, okay, go hire someone. I said, I'm a speechwriter, all right? He said, it's your idea, you're stuck with it, go hire someone. So I did. I found a guy, originally an Iraqi, was living in Lebanon, did a PhD on the medieval controversy between Ibn Rushd and Ibn Ghazala. Any of you who know something about this part of the world and you know a little bit of Muslim history, you know what I'm talking about. If you don't, they're the books. And so this guy was perfect because the Muslim world at the time in the Arab countries was still basically in the 11th, 12th century debating the same thing that Ibn Rushd and Ibn Ghazala were yelling about each other in the 11th century. So it's perfect, and he did a great job. So this is what happens when you join the State Department. Last point. How am I doing for time?
You got a couple minutes.
Okay.
About 3.
So I wrote an article in Orbis. It was a speech originally, and it's called Comte's Caveat, and that's Auguste Comte, the founder of modern sociology. And I just did that so somebody would notice the article. That's what the titles are for. Comte's Caveat: How We Misunderstand Terrorism. This is in the summer 2008 edition of Orbis. So this is what, 15 years old. 15 years old. Well, I had to pick this up and read it for at least a decade. But I figured since I was coming here, this afternoon, I probably ought to look at it. And you know what? It's darn good, actually, I have to say. Some of the stuff I read that I wrote back when, I go, why did I say that? This is actually pretty good. And an elaboration of what I told you a few minutes ago about how the analogs were all wrong and how people really didn't understand the roots and the origins of the violence. It's all there. And so I recommend that you take a look at it. But then I found this, wasn't even looking for it. Here's something I wrote for an organization called Al-Mesbah, because Al-Mesbah, which is in the United Arab Emirates, where I used to have kind of a column, and it was published in Arabic and in English. And it's kind of an unusual opportunity for someone here in the United States, right, to be able to directly address an Arabic reading audience. So this was a real fun thing. So this is the English. I'm not going to read you the Arabic, right? I'm not going to read it at all. But this is called The Two Sides of Counterterrorism. And this gets really more to the point that you're talking about. Counterterrorism, as it got institutionalized after 9/11 in countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan and elsewhere, it's really a kind of a schizophrenic thing. There are two aspects to it. And even in the United States, when we try to think through what de-radicalization or counter-radicalization, counterterrorism means in a domestic context, it's really the same thing. There are two sides of it. One side of it is therapy, and the other side of it is police work. Okay? Now, ordinarily, therapists and police are different subcultures. They don't really get along that well. They don't even know what the other side does. But the radicalization process often involves frustrated males, and it's almost all males. There are some exceptions, but not that many, who are self-isolates, and many display autistic symptoms of one kind or another. They're socially awkward. And if you're sitting in front of a computer and you're looking at a dark website, right, you have the whole archive in front of you. You can sit there by yourself for weeks and absorb all this stuff. Nobody will bother you these days. So when this all started in 2001, the internet was a baby, right? Now we have radical affinity groups. You have virtual communities. And so when people are lonely and isolated, and more Americans live, a larger percentage of Americans live alone today than ever in the history of the United States. And these gamers these men have taken themselves out of the labor force and sit around playing games, right, and watching porn, drinking booze, smoking pot, for 12 hours a day, watching these. Don't laugh. There are a lot of people who are like this, unfortunately. My heart goes out to them. They feel humiliated, and they are candidates for going nuts, because one of the nice things about face-to-face relations is you have reality checks from peer exchanges. When you spend all your time by yourself, right, and you're watching a screen, or doing a game, your brain drops from beta down into alpha, down into low alpha, if you're not moving your eyes when you're watching that screen, you're in theta, man. You're at 12 hertz. You can't bring critical facilities to bear on anything you see or hear at 12 hertz. All right. I don't know how much cognitive psych you know, but that book isn't there. But you just take my word for it. These guys are candidates. First thing, in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the first thing that God said was not good. What was the first thing that God said was not good? It is not good that
Man is alone.
men should be alone. Loneliness is the first. Who got that right? Excellent. Thank you. Loneliness is dangerous. All right. Hannah Arendt spent a lot of time talking about this back in the 1950s. Social isolates are the people you have to look at. So that's a psychological, it's a therapy issue. Okay. But then there's also the police work issue. Once a terrorist act has been perpetrated, you finish with therapy for the time being. You got other things you need to do. So the trick in dealing with terrorism is to find ways to marry the therapy and the police work. And we don't do too bad in this country, but it's spotty. It goes place by place. And I'm not an expert on this. My expertise is an ocean and a half away. I never did any work really on domestic counterterrorism, but people I've talked to say it's basically the same thing. It's just trying to find this formula to marry the therapy and the police work. Last thing. Right now in this country, right now in this city, all right, to be perfectly honest with you, worrying about terrorism in the Middle East is way down the list of things that keep me up at night. I think there are things that do keep me up at night, and I'm not even talking about my wife, who's right here. That's a nice thing that keeps me up at night. I'm talking about other things that keep me up at night. But I'm getting more worried. I think Luke suggested I'm getting a little bit more worried about where we're headed in this country. I have I don't know. I'm not a prophet, but I think in the next 20 months we're going to be in a really bad place, quite possibly, as we move toward the midterms, 2026 midterms. If I'm right, if the current administration has the equivalent of a Brezhnev doctrine, right, which is that once in power, always in power, never give it back, refuse to give it back by any means necessary, a lot of people think there's going to be a huge opposition. There's already a huge oppositional drag. Look at the polls, right? But even a huger oppositional drag, and that the Democrats will therefore sweep the 2026 midterms. That's a cheerful thought for some people, but they're deluded. They're absolutely deluded. First of all, the idea that there are going to be free and fair elections in states with Republican governors, you might want to rethink that. Now that these 1,600 new leaders of paramilitia basically have been pardoned on Trump's first day in office, and then there is, and then
take one.
And then there is that even if the Democrats win big in the Congress, flip the Congress, will they actually be allowed to take their seats? I can easily see a stop the steal 2.3 or whatever with all the and the intimidation of judges. I can see a real mess coming down the pike, and I can see a fair bit of political violence coming out of it, and I can see some terrorism spurting into the spume of the underlying causes. I can see that happening. So unfortunately, this subject might become a growth industry over the next year or two. I hope it doesn't happen. But of course, one needs to think through possibilities in order to plan for them. So I'll leave you with that happy note.
Adam, thank you for that. And for what it's worth, that's why we're having this conversation and hoping that it opens up further lines of inquiry. Once we get to the moderated conversation and Q&A, I would like to focus pretty deeply on the question of how we misunderstood the roots of terrorism and how that applies to understandings and misunderstandings here. And then also just general questions on the sociology and modification of that. Meantime, let's go to Ibrahim. Ibrahim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luke, and I'd like to thank ICRD for facilitating this and to Eisenhower Institute for opening their spaces for this conversation. And thank you, Adam. I want to segue from pretty much where you left. You spoke about therapy and policing, and mine will be something of prevention through healthy societies and, of course, still policing as a parallel measure. But let me begin. Let's remind ourselves a few notes. I'll quote Mike Jurgensmeyer, one of the leading scholars on this combined interaction of globalization, religion, and violence. And in his response to the question, does religion drive people to war, he reminds that, well, no, we need to take out all other factors to give a clear yes or no answer to it. And this is realistically, by the nature of the human story, is quite unlikely. However, we have to be mindful of the fact that religion provides a host of benefits, such as framing the content in absolute terms and giving that sense of confidence to the party. Its ability to demonize, its possibility of being used to demonize the opponents and valorize your own side, and providing moral justification for killing people and for eternal rewards for being killed. And through its institutions, offering a ready-made network and tying political success to this idea of blessing and redemption. So, given all these points, to break you the terrible news, in the future, it's not likely that the vulnerability of religion to exploitation is going away. As long as these facts are here and they will stay, this will continue to be the case. So the question is how we minimize this risk of vulnerability and how we address the problem when it takes place. I want to talk about on violent extremism. So there are certain shared characteristics, no matter what creed or brand. These people regard the social system as the enemy, and they have this cosmic war stance. It's all or nothing, black and white, good and evil, and rejecting any adjustment. It's very uncompromising with those who disagree, and that might not sound very smart way of looking into the world, but it gives a lot of confidence to those parties. And they tend to exclude themselves from the society, not in the sense of social networks, but in terms of its legal and normative institutions. And that's where the greatest risks comes, because this automatically means justification of violence. Those norms and legal structures are not recognized. I want to talk about this concept of theological deprivation, particularly in the Muslim case. There might be other forms of theological deprivations in other faith communities, religious communities, but the extremists built on this idea of theological deprivation. We are talking about disillusioned, alienated young Muslims, most of them males, and who struggle to define their identity, seek meaning, find meaning in a world which they believe, perception or reality doesn't matter at this point, which they believe is constantly unjust against their community, against their people, and creates constant misery for Muslims. And that's when the deprivation problem hits. There has been severe shortage of responses to address that. So many times people understandably ask these questions: where are those moderate Muslims, pro-peace Muslims? Where are those alternative voices against extremism? Well, my very brief answer is that they are squeezed between conformists and extremists. And this pressure keeps silencing them. At least that has been the case for the last half century. And I want to think that I hope that this is changing here and there. But that was the status quo. So this prevents you from developing certain Islamic social, cultural, political discourses to help these young people make a better sense of the age, of the time, of the context. So this insufficiency with the zeitgeist creates what we describe as the theological deprivation. And this void is conveniently, swiftly filled by violent extremist narrative. Because in the absence of helpful frames and answers and approaches, what they suggest is an incredibly energetic, self-confident, challenging, and masculine discourse. Nearly a decade ago, we did a transatlantic workshop series on ISIS, and one session out of 5 was dedicated to dynamics of radicalization, and their crash course, according to one reliable resource, was 8 weeks. So let that sink in. 8 weeks. And no matter what Islamic knowledge or understanding you come from, there were some people who are just recent converts, some people who come from very aggressively secular countries. Doesn't matter. In 8 weeks, they give you this microwaved ultimate answer to the ultimate questions of life. And there are a variety of factors. Again, it's going to be a dangerous reductionism to blame it to colonialism or to Islam, this overgeneralizations. But we need to be mindful of these factors such as identity crisis, perceived grievances, sense of helplessness, and limited access to quality life. And there are pull factors, this charismatic rhetoric and charismatic recruiters offering this overconfident language, absolutist ideology, and a sense of belonging and fulfillment, and revenue. So there are certain countries in the Middle East and multiple communities where, for example, culturally enshrined norms make getting married incredibly difficult. Those cultural expectations, financial expectations. And when you look at those who joined ISIS from those particular places, one of their prime motivations was to start a family in this utopian land that ISIS offered. So it's really very multi-layered. And I want to go into the case story of the Hizmet movement. The word Hizmet means service in Turkish. It's an Arabic word, like 1/3 of the Turkish language, but it basically means service. It's a faith-inspired grassroots transnational civic network of education, relief, and dialogue organizations. And my organization, Rumi Forum, is one of the earliest Hizmet nonprofits established in the United States. The primary lead figure envisioning this whole idea based on mainline Sunni Islamic references with an outward-looking, peaceful social mobilization was our late honorary chairman, Mr. Fethullah Gülen. So for those who are familiar with the news, he passed away in October after a 25-year stay in the United States. And the movement originated in early 70s, and after 90s, it became transnational, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, taking its schools, its non-confessional institutions, education institutions, first to post-Soviet countries, and then to the rest of the world. So currently, in every continent, in most of the countries in the world, there are Hizmet initiatives. We're talking about a problem that emanates somehow from religion. It's not the guilt of the religion, but that's with the direction that it is coming from. So the refutations also should be coming from within religion itself. Hizmet's refutation of violent extremism is based on mainline Sunni Islam, the Quranic principles, and the prophetic example. And so it's, first of all, these are those universally shared points that this mainline Islam has always argued and accepted. One, and that framing really shapes a lot of way of thinking and acting. One is the idea of peace being the norm, war being the exception, as opposed to this cosmic war mindset that drives radicals. And personality of guilt and this idea of collective punishment is being one of the most sinful acts one can commit. And also this sense of idea of legitimate authority rather than organized adventures. These are two very different things. Again, it boils down to how you frame it. To have the authority to call someone an enemy, an adversary, and to claim the right to use violence. And this idea that Mr. Gülen voiced many times in his life, there's no quote unquote this idea of an Islamic state. Quran, Islamic teachings leave you with some principles, and he has opposed this sense of literalist understanding of divine sovereignty, which is very highly elevated in the Quran, spoken of very highly. And according to literalist interpretations, that means there is one sovereignty, and that needs to be followed through, exercised through strictly religious and theocratic forms. Whereas sovereignty is interpreted in the mainline Islam as two layers. One is the cosmic sovereignty, and that's the exclusively divine one, and the other is the worldly sovereignty that mankind has been delegated and left with their free will about how to exercise. Hizmet is active in three arenas, as I said: relief, education, and dialogue. In the Western settings, it's mostly dialogue work. In non-Western settings, it's mostly schools. And getting closer to that particular mode of mobilization and activism, there are certain core teachings, such as love and compassion, borrowing from the Islamic spiritual tradition that, although Hizmet is not a Sufi order, it borrows a lot of key concepts from Islamic spirituality, and positive understanding and cherishing of diversity, the idea of free will. So in the extremist mindset, this victimization and fatalism leads to justification for violence. I'm abandoned by my family, by my government, by my leaders, and my people have been abandoned by the world. My religion is considered hostile by everybody else, so I am justified to do whatever I want, to respond to that. So that this escapism, this sense of victimization is replaced with this idea of free will. I have agency, capacity, and responsibility, and I can do constructive, positive work and create value. One of the most important things is self-reflexivity versus absolutism. When many non-Muslim friends ask me about what's the problem, and I said, the problem, the struggle, if you will, the fight, is between those absolutists and those self-reflexives. Because no one has the ultimate authority to say well, that's the end of the discussion in any conversation that pertains to faith and society and how to interpret religion in your time and space. As opposed to, remember this 8-week crash course that ISIS is conducting. Theirs is the exact absolutist example. They said, this is the end of the conversation. Rest assured that you don't need to worry about it and ask any questions, just go for it. Whereas this school of thought upholds this idea of self-reflexivity. And again, Hizmet is not the only faith-inspired movement or school that is upholding these ideas. It's not exclusively about the movement, but there are growing and more visible Islam-inspired initiatives that make this more visible. Constructive action. And in the particular case of Mr. Gülen, his life and career is a sequence, is a spectrum of what I call liberating scholarly interventions. I'll give you just one example. So there was this construct of abode of war, abode of Islam, abode of peace, which is a medieval construct and a child of the ages of crusades and Mongolian invasions. This sense of existence or existential threat came to such a level that the Muslim mindset divided the world into two pieces. This is the abode of war, this is the abode of Islam, and there is this gray zone that you could call abode of ceasefire. This was asked to Mr. Gülen once by a journalist. And the question was, is Turkey, which he was living back then, abode of war or abode of Islam? So it's a Muslim majority country. Back then it was aggressively secular. So how are you going to respond to this? Or let's ask these questions to a third generation Muslim who was born in Germany. Is Germany abode of war or abode of Islam? So if you say abode of Islam, it doesn't look like a very Islamic realm. But if you say abode of war, are you as a German who happens to be Muslim, are you going to be at war with your country? So, and in a very liberating tone and polite rejection of this dichotomy, Gülen said the entire world is abode of service. So he just brought a whole new frame into this. And this is just one example about his liberating scholarly interventions and messages. There are plenty of them in his writings and speeches. And coming to the policing and therapy element, the challenge with those more linear traditional government policies is that they don't, by their nature, they don't have the capacity to travel, to penetrate all the way into the underlying root causes. And sometimes they can even be misunderstood by the very target community, whereas we need a combination. And that's why we can call this model de-radicalization by default. It's very preventive. And by the way, Hizmet organizations do not have a de-radicalization program. It doesn't function this way. It's not kind of an intervention, but it's more of a prevention. And so there is no meeting with violent extremism heads on. Rather, these core teachings that Hizmet derives from its Islamic references are diametrically opposed with the extremist teachings. So when these institutions and their practices and example become manifest and functioning and visible in a certain setting, there is this negative correlation between this presence and the ability of radical recruitment and radicalization. One really outstanding example is Hizmet schools opening to Central Asia and Balkan countries in 1990s. So during this post-Soviet uncertainty, there were a lot of very ambitious, radical, literalist, even violent groups who wanted to make these post-Soviet settings their new breeding ground with their preachers and large budgets and devotees, basically. And Hizmet was very swift in taking its school models to those countries. And I'm quoting independent analysis and reports, and there are multiple observers and multiple analyses that conclude that the presence of the Hizmet schools, especially in Central Asia, prevented a mass and very swift radicalization of this whole region during this very critical early post-Soviet years. So thank you very much for bearing with me. I hope this has stimulated some questions, comments, responses, and I'll look forward to the interaction.
It has certainly inspired some for me, Ibrahim, and I'm grateful for this further thought. We were going to push this conversation into a lot more of the American domestic context, but the further we get into it, the more I realize that the conceptual question of what exactly all this is something that we could probably hit for the rest of this conversation. So we're going to turn a little bit more towards that than the original. If you have questions once we get to the Q&A on American domestic, we would welcome those very much. In the meantime, I just have a few thoughts on what this means for American domestic before we get to the remainder of this. And I am increasingly, and this is something that I think has been hovering in the air for a while, but I think a lot of the frameworks on domestic radicalization questions that we use nowadays are sort of premised on the idea that there are discrete key interventions right before the act, that you can treat this as a security and law enforcement threat as the primary sort of thing that, under the understandings that Adam and Ibrahim are talking about, are not quite the thing that hits the root and the reason of this. And you don't really have months or years to fix this kind of stuff, but it's making me realize that maybe one of the things that could be looked up at over the longer term is there a social direct intervention more than a law enforcement direct intervention of sorts? That's an interesting question that I think there's probably some American sociological research on crime that could be interesting, but when we get to the questions of political violence, that opens up other things. Many of the circumstances both Ibrahim and Adam talked about are very, very sadly present in increasing amounts in the United States of America of the 2010s and 2020s, then is helpful to know. The decline of social trust between Americans and every single one of their political, social, and cultural institutions. Number two, the loneliness and enemy thing, not just among young men, but also among people in general. Decline of civil society, decline of what some of our friends across town call third spaces. Number three, and this is one of the very worrisome ones, the rapid cultural changes that are not just positive. There's a lot of positive cultural change, but there's also a lot of total deconstructions of old norms that kept a lot of order around. The role of men in society seems to have been reshaped in ways that have been positive and sometimes, but also similarly to what's happened in the Islamic world. It is unclear what that means for family formation. It is unclear what that means for financial independence. It is unclear what that means for all the traditional markers of social status and men feeling useful. And add to that the isolation, the loneliness, the sense of victimization that you see young men on the internet in particular, and increasingly just in real life. That opens weird cocktail of things. And honestly, some of these people are my friends, and I worry about them myself on some of these questions too. Drug use and substance abuse rates, we didn't talk too much about that, but there's that increasingly. And then we all have seen over time the ideological and political polarization that increasingly is the tenor of our public discourse. Whether that is the thing that drives this radicalization, whether that is something that's similar to religious radicalization, is something that is driven by the cultural and social changes, is something that I will be interested in talking about. But why is this important? Ever since the mid-2010s, we have seen what feels like an increasingly rapid series of incidents and different styles of political radicalization resulting in violence. Just to name a few, the 2011 shooting of Representative Gabrielle Giffords and others in Tucson, Arizona, 2017. The shooting of U.S. Majority Whip Steve Scalise and others at the congressional baseball game in Alexandria. The 2017 white supremacist riot in Charlottesville, Virginia. Too many school shootings to count, various lingering acts of Islamist terrorism, particularly with ISIS, including by a surprising number of former U.S. Army service members who joined the ISIS circles after their service ended. The 2014 shooting by an incel named Elliot Rodger in the University of California, Santa Barbara. Numerous acts of racist terrorism, Dylan Roof at the Charleston church shooting in 2015, the 2018 Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, many others, car bombings and truck attacks, knife attacks, too many mass shootings to count. And closer to our own time, the long year 2020, fights in the streets between people called the Proud Boys and Antifa, and just various white supremacist, anarchist organizations taking the protests and riots during that long summer into things that law enforcement saw as very, very different than anything that had come before. The 2021 invasion of and riot in the United States Capitol building on January 6th by a right-wing mob encouraged even by President Donald Trump. The 2024 attempted assassination of President Donald Trump. The 2022 attack on the husband of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Paul Pelosi. Probably one of the most interesting and niche events here, the 2024 assassination in New York City of the healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, by a fairly successful young millennial man named Luigi Mangione, in a case that is especially worrisome because he does not fit the stereotypical hopeless young man image of all these things, which opens up different questions of ideology. Many of these cases, these are young white men, not all, but the vast majority of them. And in a similar way to young men in the Islamic world facing these sorts of things, you begin to wonder to what degree is this just a powder keg in the United States waiting to burn. And again, some of these are people I know, people who I have in internet communities, people I know in some of the young policy circles here in DC. I worry about the things that they talk about and the things that they undergo. Same with people from the places I've lived back in the heartland. So this is stuff that I think is relevant, as Adam was suggesting, to current American politics in ways that the relationship between the ideological polarization and the social decay just seems like we don't really fully discuss it in as sophisticated a way as we could. You usually either hear young white men with no circumstances or incredible right-wing and left-wing extremism changing people's minds. The relationship between those two things is not always particularly clear. In 2021, President Joe Biden issued a national strategy for countering domestic terrorism. Various agencies in the federal government have been working on these issues for quite some time. Hopefully they do. And I think at some level, this is the circumstance that we find ourselves in. I'd like to continue this conversation with Adam and Ibrahim on just the general ways all of these factors, not necessarily in the United States, but in radicalization in general, relate to each other. We'll do that for a couple minutes, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. So with that, and we'll remain seated for this part as we go on. Adam, there was a particular thing that you said that just kind of struck me about what happened, particularly in the Iraq War and just counterterrorism at that point. That we in the United States security community just had a completely wacky idea of what we were dealing with. We believed that this was an ideological conflict. We believed that this was something where the West was the chief target. That was clearly a category problem in how we approached it, led to horrendous misapplications of strategy. And just on the basis of it, I'm wondering what you think about that in general. Like to the degree that you follow counter-radicalization stuff, are there just like wrong frameworks currently being used and historically being used by most of the actors who try to do this in law enforcement?
Well, I don't, as far as you're talking about the United States, I really don't know. It's just not, it's not something that I pay a lot of attention to. But when it comes to the Middle East, there have been counter-radicalization or de-radicalization programs in lots of different countries over the years. And because, let's take Saudi Arabia. Saudis understand, some of the Saudis understand their own societies pretty well, right? So one of the things that they have been doing over years is if they got somebody in jail for being a member of a terrorist organization, some illegal group or whatever, they don't release them until they reconnect them to a social structure in which there is some kind of reality check on them, right? You don't just make somebody learn something from a book or have them watch a couple of movies and then send them back out on the street with nowhere to go, right? You got to link them back up to their comms, to their to their family structure, to their extended family. And most of the work that the Saudis do is not with the individual, it's with the family. Tell the family how to treat this guy once we let him out of jail. So there's actually been a fair bit of success. You don't have a lot of recidivism in some, but you don't have a lot of recidivism. So these societies understand their own mores and their own language and their own people. And they don't do such a bad job. And we could learn a lot, I think, from going and talking to the Jordanians, going and talking to the Egyptians. There are problems here. For example, it's in remember the famous Arab Spring in 2011, right? And a lot of people thought, aha, here you see now the forward strategy for freedom is about to succeed, and they're going to be 5, 7, 8, 12, 22 new democracies in the Arab world. No, that's not what happened. Only in Tunisia was there even a scintilla of a hope, and that's gone. All right. And the reason is what I said: the analytical, the attitudinal predicates within the culture aren't there yet for Western forms of liberal democracy. There are, however, in Islamic culture and in Islam, there are lots of models of pluralism and toleration. So the way to get this kind of thing done is to mobilize symbols and concepts already within the culture and just change the balance. I mean, what the Muslim world has been suffering, we're suffering now in this country too, is the return of the zero sum. A man named Milton Rokich many years ago wrote a book called The Open and Closed Mind. And what he meant by the closed mind was a Manichaean closed, either or kind of mind. Law of the jungle, might makes right, only winners and losers. Is anybody coming to mind when I say these things? So we have elected now twice somebody who epitomizes a pre-enlightenment law of the social Darwinism without the social Darwin. I mean, just a primitive attitude toward the nature of social life, where there is only conflict and there can't be cooperation. And by the way, this is mirrored on the illiberal left, where the very same premise is operating. So we have an illiberal right and a liberal left. They have a lot more in common than either side would agree, but they both are totally persuaded that life is a zero-sum, only winners and losers, only exploited and exploiters proposition. And of course, there's not a social scientist in the world but worth his salt who would agree with this. It's much more complex than that. We have lots of cooperative ways that we're social animals. If there was no element of cooperation in our DNA, we wouldn't exist as a species. All right. So this is a primitive, it's a Randian, ridiculous way of thinking about it. But we are inundated now in this country with derivative zero sum. And in the Muslim world, much of the Muslim world, for circumstances that we don't have time to go into, this is kind of a natural way of Dar al-Islam, Dar al-Harb, that idea, pretty deeply embedded over the years. You're right. It comes from the year 1258, I'm sure you all know, the Mongols destroyed the Abbasid dynasty, and they created mountains of eyeballs on the banks of the Euphrates River in Baghdad. And that completely shattered the Muslim world at the time. And Ibn Ghazala and various other exegetes at the time broke new ground in Islamic theological thinking, never became the mainstream, but this worked into Wahhabism, and Wahhabism, because of the money from the oil after 1973, 74, 79, Saudis were promoting Wahhabism and Wahhabi madrasas and Wahhabi mosques all over the world, and you suddenly saw this very strange shift in Islam, where a normal Islam that had been in existence for hundreds and hundreds, and Sunni Islam we're talking about, hundreds and hundreds of years, suddenly shifted because of what happened with the Saudi proselytization of what had been at the time a minoritarian and very marginal form of Islam, now became much more important. So that's what happened there. What happened here to create the revenant zero sum is much more complicated, and I've written about it, but we don't have time to go through with it right now. But so the way to deal with this kind of stuff is to use local cultural resources. I mean, going to from Americans or Europeans going to Saudi Arabia or going to Afghanistan and saying, we can solve your problems. Just do what we tell you, you'll be okay. I mean, Americans are control freaks. Every time we go into a foreign country for any reason and we try to form partnerships with non-Western societies, we screw it up every time because we're control freaks and we're impatient and we're getting more impatient. Everybody's getting more impatient. These things, the magic rectangles, they speed everybody up. The circuitry in this phone works 7 times faster than the circuitry in your brain. Your brain works on 25 watts, like a dim light bulb. I'm not saying anything personal. Because of the cytoarchitecture of our brains, we have really efficient brains. This is not efficient. It needs 7 times as much power to do half the things, a tenth of the things that our brains can do. Magic rectangle, okay? We are sped up, all right? That's not something we haven't talked about too much, but it's not just the zero sum. There are a whole range of man-made, environmental, the digital tsunami that we have lapped on ourselves that are making this worse.
And
Right.
there's a question, the semiotics of this is interesting, but you said at the beginning of this, the mobilization of symbols and concepts already in
the culture.
integrated culture. And that's something that now that you mention it, I think a lot about the sociological work that a lot of good people like David Brooks's folks at the Aspen Institute and a lot of the people, Richard Reeves runs the Institute for Boys and Men. There's a lot of folks doing really serious policy work on sociological and just like the loneliness epidemic. I'm thinking about it, and almost all of the ones that I can think of off the top of my head are basically associated with the center or the center left. There's a couple very astute cultural institutes and cultural commentators on the right and the center and even far right that address the same things, not as a policy question, but at the level of like an analysis of cultural decay, and it basically blames modernization processes. But at some level, those even are stuck in the conflicts of the 80s and 90s. Those haven't really updated for what you're calling the Randian kind of times. There's a kind of part of me that mulls like just the fact that number one, there's very much an internet dynamic to this, and number two, a very you have lost an America that was a great America, where I, a young man, could have been a cowboy, I could have been an astronaut, I could have been a business owner, I could have been a dad, is not really there anymore. What you're saying about the dynamics of there being a healthy reorientation of symbols and concepts that lead to this toxicity ideologically, that you can reorient that into something helpful, actually sounds a lot like a lot of the revivalist ideas of American national identity. And also, I think at some level, a lot of the things that people who advocate for universal mandatory national service, when they're talking about we need a shared experience for American youth, or we need to have a shared set of common symbols. Granted, I think most of the approaches to that have not really done it in direct response to this, but the idea that you can reconstruct something on the basis of what the radicalizing folks think that they have lost and redirect it into something healthier just seems interesting. And I want to say that will probably require a lot more engagement of people on the political right who are, number one, ideologically closer to the world that is radicalizing, but number two, have like this, and I'm conservative, right? Have this kind of romanticist sense of American pasts that I think is less the focus on the center and the center left policy world. This is something that I'm going to take away from this and mull. But Ibrahim, you had said something about you've said things in the past about the idea of an Abrahamic tradition as something that is useful for interfaith work. Adam had suggested things about that not being nearly as deep of a reality in the Middle East as it's sometimes thought to be, as the Bush administration thought it to be. But whatever the case is, there's a way that, like, what you guys do over at the Rumi Forum and some of the projects that you work on right now are an attempt to reconstruct or even pioneer an identity and a general kind of social ethos that does redirect some of these toxic things into healthy things. And so I'm wondering for both of you, but Ibrahim, you first, to what degree the reconstruction of narrative and the reconstruction of identity in syncretic ways is something that is useful in the social long term for this kind of radicalization problem? Because I hadn't really thought about that before this, but it just strikes me that that's one of the questions here.
People are in search for spaces. By our very natural human predisposition, we want to be able to welcome, belong, and find meaning. So whenever I'm invited, I talk about to existing or potential volunteer groups. I keep reminding people that don't over-expect from this whole idea of dialogue. Even within a non-violent but divided social setting, because it invests yourself in the idea of journey rather than taking a transactional stance about what do we achieve, where do we get. We certainly have a destination in mind, and you pretty much described it. But this idea of this journey, let's use the journey metaphor, or the idea of these spaces being present is inherently valued. That is one achievement that is not negligible. And I'm a direct witness of these spaces becoming almost social shelters for people during times of crisis, where they find solidarity and where they find their attitudes being reinforced, rather than, because without those spaces, people who hold these strong beliefs in that we can create healthy societies and are committed to, without those spaces, they will feel like political orphans. So maybe they will not turn violent or whatsoever, but they will feel numb and dysfunctional and paralyzed. And those who are vulnerable will be even more vulnerable to toxic, exclusivist, aggressive ideologies. So that's what we want to maintain, so that these spaces have a pulse and they have a certain pace that is immune, that has its autonomy vis-a-vis the ups and downs of politics at home and in the Middle East, speaking of more specific issues.
Adam, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of things. Anybody here remember the Danish television series from some years ago called Borgen? Anybody ever see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, one person. Well, this was a Danish TV show. It was about 15 years ago. I don't remember. About a woman who becomes prime minister of Denmark. And her name is Borgen, right? So at one of the episodes, she goes to Greenland. You've heard of Greenland Line. It's been in the news a lot lately. Right? She goes to Greenland, and it's supposed to be just a meet and greet with the governor, the Danish appointed governor of Greenland, who's an Inuit, of course. And she just, she became prime minister. She goes to Greenland. She shakes the guy's hand. She says, you know, how you doing? Nice to meet you. See you later. He goes, no, you're not going anywhere. He says, we have real problems here. We have rampant alcoholism. We have suicide. We have kids dropping out of school. We have families dissolving. Make a long story short, what this Danish woman learns from this Inuit is that the people have lost their stories. It's about stories. They've lost their stories. The progressive modernization, westernization, occupation came so fast that people, it's just like what happens on Indian reservations in this country. It's like the ghost dances, right? People went, you know, they got cargo cult. They did rituals hoping that somehow the threat to their corporate identity would go away, but it didn't go away, and as a result, they lost their story. So it's very similar, what we're talking about here. A guy named Mark Lewis wrote a book called The Biology of Desire. I doubt if anybody's heard of it. It's too bad. He's a scholar of addiction, right? Not just this kind of addiction. This stuff is really, where's my phone? Anyway, the phones, they're addictive. They can be addictive, literally. But he said the way that you cure an addiction, right, when you're successful, is you don't cure an addiction by pushing somebody through a withdrawal phase, right? That almost never works, no matter what addiction you're dealing with. The only way a person, you don't cure an addiction, you transcend it. How do you transcend it? You teach the person stories that they can tell themselves that have positive endings, right? That's how you treat an addiction. The same thing is true with violent extremism. I mean, these simple stories, like you might the 8-week course from ISIS, right? The sort of like comic book, simple, zero-sum simplistic stories. And most of these people who are radicalized don't have madrasa educations. They don't know anything about Islam. The conflict entrepreneurs will pick a verse out of the Quran. They'll pick a hadith, you know, a saying of the Prophet. They'll pick something and they'll say, this is the whole of the Islamic tradition. And they're lying, right? They're just manipulating these ignorant people. But they telling them a story, right? And then the story is shared with other people who are being dished the same garbage, right? So you have this peer group consolidation, you know, or what's the word I want? Reinforcement. And here's you know, every origin story of every large major religious tradition, every faith community, every origin story is kind of improbable, isn't it? From a scientific point of view, it's even improbable from a mythic point of view. Why is that? A lot of people think, well, all these are old stories, and this was in the childhood of the species, and this is because people were primitive minded at the time, and that's why they told these wild creation of origin. That's not right. That's wrong. The reason that this stuff works, right, to congeal a group, is that if you can believe something in common with other people who are something that's very improbable, right, that creates an incredible bond between you, and that's what these groups do. They tell very, very simplistic, extreme stories, and you believe them in the context, reinforcing with other people, and that's what creates the group bond, right? All faith communities start out as cults, and that's what they do, right? You've got to figure out how to tell different stories to people. You've got to get rid of that story and give them a better story, a different that they can also share with other people. It's not just his myth. I mean, there are other examples, like you said. For example, the Ahmadiyya movement in India is a good example. That's very cultural specific because there are a lot of Muslims in India, but there are even more Hindus. So it's a very specific situation. But there are lots of groups, even within Shia Islam. There are examples of this. Fewer, but there are examples of this. It's all about the stories you tell. All right, that's what's really important. And again, it has to be organic to the culture, or it won't stick, it won't work. You can't import it from someplace else.
Before we go to one couple other questions I have, just off the top of everybody's heads, who is interested in asking a question in the Q&A? Okay, cool. In that case, we'll do one more main question, and then we'll get to Q&A pretty shortly here. One of the things that is a cardinal rule of depolarization work, like the Braver Angel style, is that people of any ideology and any set of political beliefs, even the craziest and most violent, are invited into depolarization work. It's kind of the point. And so there's a way that when programs for depolarization code as liberal or code as conservative, that drives people who are on the further sides of the other side of the aisle away from that work, in the sense that the work is trying to convert them, or that the work fundamentally does not respect them for being the political agents that they are. In a kind of parallel on this work, it dawns on me that because there is such a high political stake in much of this fundamentally kind of social amelioration question, you both mentioned the tensions between Ibrahim, I believe you said it was the extremists versus the conformists, and the big middle between them. Adam, you said it was the traditional nativists versus the modernizers versus the reformists. And it seems to me at some level that because this work is presumably going to always be done by people in either the reformist or the modernizer or the conformist or like broad middle kind of camps, there's a way that if it's coded that way, it has the prospect of actually driving away those who are most vulnerable of radicalization, people in the hyper-traditionalist and the native camps. In the American context, this is much more easily discernible. I think when you have a Biden administration program against domestic radicalization, it's not wrong for extreme right-wing kind of Ruby Ridge people to imagine that that is targeted only at them and not at Antifa. And similarly, if the Trump administration were to do a domestic radicalization counter program and talk all about the pro-Palestine supporters on college campuses or all about Antifa and stuff like that, people who are in those communities would not be wrong to imagine that that's a political attack on them. Is it possible for there to be approaches to this kind of social renewal that one of the happy circumstances after it would be de-radicalization? Is it possible to have an approach that is not politically coded in that sort of way in any society? That's something that bothers me a lot at this point, particularly because of the political stakes, and wondering if you, I don't know, have any particular thoughts on it, and then we'll get to Q&A. So,
That's a great question. My immediate response is just 2 words: good luck. No, really, it's very hard. I mean, the younger you get people, into situations, social mixing and so forth, where we teach them that what's usually construed in this kind of a society as opposites are not opposites; they're really complements, like the Vedas. I mean, Brahmins have a much more sophisticated idea of these things than Westerners tend to have. The better, younger the better. But we do tend to divide into, cowboys and Indians, chocolate and vanilla, good guys, bad guys. It's just part of the the Christological water in the goldfish bowl. It's just what the country is, really. So, yeah, I think there's going to be a sense of political valence tilted against certain groups pretty much always. Now, that may not have been the case when Dwight Eisenhower was president, when he said, I don't mean to poke fun at Ike, but he said, people should, practice the religion, go to the church of their choice, and I don't give a damn what it is. So he said something to that effect, right? This was a book called, I forget the author's name, called Piety on the Potomac, when we put In God We Trust on the bills. That was in the mid-50s. It's very interesting sociological.
yeah,
time.
but in that time, the radicals were communists on the one hand and Klansmen on the other hand.
Yeah, and religious people, normal people. So go worship at the church of your choice, and I don't care what it is. It's a very famous remark. It's very hard to do that in a society today where the middle is being anviled by the illiberal left and the illiberal right, and all of this, of course, is megaphoned by the clickbait media, which is just for market share. Okay. And by the way, I brought the books for a reason. Okay. Anybody who thinks that you can understand a complex subject like the one we're talking about in a part of the world where Americans typically don't know very much history and culture, anybody who thinks you can understand that by watching talking heads on a screen, I'm so sorry. You can't. It's all infotainment. It's all garbage. You have to read to understand these things. There are no shortcuts. And here's the problem. There are plenty, for example, back during the Bush administration, there are plenty of people in the government, no less, not to mention, at the universities, who understand this stuff, who not just read these books, but write them, okay? But there's a disconnect between the political class and the intellectual class. And that's something that has grown over time. And it's nobody's particular fault, really. I mean, part of it is the fault of the academy, which alienated itself from politics, from practical government. And part of it is the fault of the political class, which has become more performative than substantive over time for reasons we don't have time to go into. But really, it's in the culture. I mean, what do most Americans do? I mean, college educated, what do we do when we're finished work? We have dinner. What do we do? We go and we turn on the television set. And a lot of people do. We spend hours and hours and hours.
Now it's YouTube. So.
Whatever it is. It's even worse. Or TikTok, even worse. So you're looking at a two-dimensional screen, right? It's two-dimensional, folks. It's not real. It's counterfeit consciousness. It can't help but being that, okay? There are technical events that pop out little sort of a dopamine in your body. You do it so often you don't even know you're doing it. It's called a technical. So you say you're standing on a street in some city and you're talking to George over there. Next shot is a cut shot, and you're on the roof of a building across the street. Your body can't do that. You need a machine to pop that kind of sensory disruption into your brain, all right? And every time you do that, your visual system is connected to your endocrine system and your limbic system, and you pop off a little dopamine.
At the end of this, we'll tell you about Adam's Substack book.
Okay, so we are living in a world right now where people watch so much of this commercialized CGI entertainment stuff and they're watching it again. They're watching it on a screen in a semi-darkened room with their eyes are not moving and their brains are in theta. They cannot, once they get out of from being in front, they cannot construct an explanation or an account of a real world problem or policy question that is any more complicated than the dumbed down script of a sitcom or a Marvel Comics movie. Just can't do it. Their brains are their brains are habituated to this kind of narrative, to this kind of script. So, I mean, think about it. In the election in November, this is relevant. I'll get back. So, democracy is under threat. The rule of law is under threat, and then there's the price of eggs. Okay? And all the polls show, yeah, people realize that there might be something over there, but that's a conceptual matter. That's an abstraction, right? If people don't read very much, if they spend all their time watching screens, it's very hard for people to get their hands around an abstraction or to get their hands around a concept. But the price of eggs is concrete, right? So the mind that doesn't read, the mythic mind, the pre-enlightenment mind, is schizophrenic. It understands concreteness and it understands otherworldly stuff like conspiracy theories. But that whole area in the middle of concepts and abstractions, not so well anymore, okay? That's how you can get polls that say, oh, yeah, well, yeah, democracy, yeah, but it's the price of eggs. And one more thing, I can't resist. Do you know how many people in this country, how many adult Americans are carrying credit card debt month to month? You know what the percentage is? Anybody want to guess? Anybody know?
60. 70.
Not quite, but it's about 50%. About 50%. It goes a little higher, it goes a little lower, and the average debt month to month is, in excess of $8,000 or $10,000. And people are paying, the 1/100th. They're paying the $42 on a debt of $4,250. They will never get out of debt doing that. Why do people do that? Why do they do that? Because they're in the now. They're in the wow now. Because in the mythic mind that is induced by this kind of novelty technology entertainment, there is no before and after. Dots don't connect. You know, not everybody is an impulse buyer. I mean, some people are just don't have a lot of money and they have kids and they got to feed them and all that. But a lot of this is impulse buying because there's no before and after in this mindset. It's the price of eggs. I'm going to buy that. I don't care if I'm in debt, right? This is the kind of world we live in right now, right? And that's why I think this does tie in. People get they get sucked into the surreal, right? You play a video game, a violent video game, right? So, somebody dies, you push the reset button, and the game starts all over again. It doesn't connect. Terrorism, the incubation of terrorism is not divorced from this mentality, it seems to me. I'll stop there.
Ibrahim, is apolitical de-radicalization and totally apolitical social reintegration possible?
I'll take a few steps back and come into more contemporary dynamics. So people, you might have heard this historical reference of Islam's golden age, which defines the first 4 to 5 centuries of Islamic history. That's a nice exaggeration. Probably there is no golden age in human experience, but it was a time of remarkable achievements. Rather than using maybe this kind of romanticizing word, I find more value in what dynamics were giving shape to that era. And when you have a closer look, it is freedom of expression, private property, and decentralized power. So there was a strong merchant class. There was an independent scholarly class. So before 12th century, less than 10% of Muslim scholars were on government payroll. After 12th century, after this conservative movement expelled most of philosophy and science out of the curriculum and built a kind of a conservative, centralized orthodoxy in the madrasa system on government payroll. It was after 13th century, most of the Muslim achievement is military because we had nothing but gunpowder empires. So that I really like that term. Ottomans, Safavids, and the Mughals. They were literally gunpowder empires. They had no business class. They had no independent merchant class, no private property. Everything was the belonging of the absolute monarch, one man at the top. And those who were to think and deliberate and ask were on government payroll. That's 12th, 13th century onwards. So fast forward to this day, this as long as this status quo exists, this risk of people being, this potential being squeezed between conformists and extremists will continue. It's very interesting. We have the oldest, most prestigious institutions of Islamic scholarship in the Muslim majority countries, whereas the best publications and ideas coming from the Western Hemisphere. They are being authored and discussed and proposed by Muslims living in the Western Hemisphere because there are no gatekeepers here. So this cannot be cherished enough. This cannot be valued enough. Like we're talking about the liberties and freedoms, and speaking of my very maybe a particular Muslim angle here, I cannot think of a more valuable, vital context than such strongly free and open settings for this sought after renewal in thinking and liberation from extremist tendencies to be able to succeed. So my my precondition for this particular story and probably the many others is to maintain this space that where the conversation, those freedoms can be exercised without any reservation. So that's my remark.
Thank you for those very optimistic answers about the future of apolitical decolorization. I will keep working on that, and I'll get back to you once the research department has something. Let's go to a couple of quick questions, and Adam and Ibrahim, if you can keep your answers somewhat briefer so we can get through a few. Also, Adam, is horse flop a solid or a liquid?
It's in between.
Okay, great. Sounds good. Let's go to a couple of questions. Sir, in the front.
Yeah, I'd like to thank Adam and Ibrahim and you, Luke, for putting this show on. I just wanted to add to the formidable insights that you guys have provided and to put a little flesh on the bones in terms of how it works in the real world. What you said about local cultural resources is absolutely on the money. And one of the things we found in ICRD and we're countering violent extremism was that the best way to get to extremists is to get at the nonviolent conservatives. Those are the ones they listen to, and that can work. But in all of the places that the center's gone around the world, trouble spots, trying to make religion part of the solution, common to all of them was the fact of very heavy emphasis on empathy and on what we call organic suasion, which is sort of building peace from within. And a good example of that was the work that we did for 8 years, reforming the madrasas in Pakistan, the religious schools, including those that gave birth to the Taliban. And there we were trying to transform their pedagogy and increase their curriculums to include the physical and social sciences with a heavy emphasis on human rights and religious freedom. What had happened was in the Middle Ages, these madrasas were without peer as institutions of higher learning in the world at the time. And it was Western exposure to them that led to our own university system in the West. And you'd be surprised at the traditions and mores in academia that trace their roots to the madrasas. You know, the gowns we wear, the mortarboards and tassels, funding a chair in a given discipline. And what we did over those 8 years is we succeeded with about 1,600 madrasas and about 3,000 leaders. Why we were able to do it, and where others had not been able to, including the government of Pakistan, there were 3 reasons. One is we pursued the project in such a way that the madrasa leaders felt it was their reform effort and not something imposed from the outside, which meant they had considerable say in the change process. Second was inspiring it with their own heritage, about what I just spoke about. The third was to ground all suggested change in Islamic principles so they could feel that they were becoming good Muslims in the process. And they were. So it's just one of those things where we found that when you can get past the hostility and rage that many of these folks feel, not only do they get it, but many of them become champions of what you're talking about at great personal risk to themselves. You know, we have talked in this country about wanting to drain the swamp of terrorism. Well, bombs and bullets have their place, but they only beget more terrorists as the cycle of revenge takes hold. But if you can win hearts and minds, that becomes contagious. I'll just give you one example of how this worked in action. At one point, the center was conducting a workshop for 16 madrasas surrounding the Swat Valley, which is a resort area up in the mountains of Pakistan, which the Taliban had taken over. And towards the end of the workshop, one gentleman stands up, was not only a madrasa leader, but he was a commander of Lashkar-e Taiba, which is the terrorist group that brought all the attacks on Mumbai a few years earlier. He gets up and he says, I came here for one reason and one reason only. It's to discredit everything you have to say. He says, but now I find myself standing here before you full of rage. Rage because for 26 years, I've studied and taught the Quran the way it was taught. He says, I now, for the first time, have sensed the soul of the Holy Quran and its peaceful intent. And I now see that the right way to advance Islam is through peace, not through conflict. I've got to change what I teach my students and tell them why. A month later, we came back and we had a CNN team with us. They were wanting to televise our workshop. He said it to them as well. But which, heads rolled for a lot less than that, but probably because he's a terrorist commander, he cut some slack with that. But it just is this organic suasion business of, all of these cultures have the right peace-making tenets there available. And the trick isn't to go in and try to convince them through Western religious practice. It's to capitalize on what they've done themselves. So I just want to say that. And I wanted to ask Ray, would you just say a few words about the domestic scene?
Yeah, I was going to do that at the end when we kind of close out.
Yeah, we'll do that. Doug, thank you for that very much. Adam, Ibrahim, do you have any immediate thoughts, reactions on that quickly before we get to another question?
Just a footnote, the first university ever in the world was Al-Qarawiyyin University in Fez, Morocco. It's founded by a woman, right? And just to give you an example of not even talking about the library in Cordoba in Islamic Spain, but in Al-Qarawiyyin in, I might get this wrong, 11th century, right? There were classmates there who weren't Muslims, right? One was Maimonides, and the other was the future Pope Sylvester II. That's a golden age, Just thought you'd be interested in that little factoid.
We use that in our workshops.
Do we have further questions? Yes, back here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Adam, Ibrahim, and Luke for speaking with us. I have a question about kind of how to balance national security with potentially the threat of American hegemony, because obviously a lot of motivation for terrorism in the Middle East can be drawn back to that threat of what we were talking about, either Western hegemony or American hegemony or that influence in the region. But in our current geopolitical state, I don't ever really see in future times the US fully withdrawing either their military or their influence from the Middle East as is. So I guess how do you balance our country's need for national security with this very real threat that the more we push that need of national security onto the region, the more we push people into extreme violence?
Well, yeah, so this, as Adam explained earlier, the most immediate enemy of these groups were their own governments, who were machines almost obsessed with threat from their own peoples, especially under Ba'athist movements and also other regimes, other monarchies. So, their hostility towards the West. I also agree that is a byproduct of that core hostility, and because society and religion are so enmeshed and intertwined, they were able to make the mosque their corridor of mobilization and recruitment, and this also unfortunately blended terribly with the colonial memory. But in the overall, it was absence of due channels, working channels of expression, participation, and distribution. And to nobody's surprise, this multi-layered vengeful feelings toward their own governments and towards the West, particularly the U.S., became the defining status of this. So I think, these reinforcing those channels, making sure that those that are not absent are present, and those that are present are not just ceremonial, but they are really functional channels of participation, expression. Then, being a champion of this, being a supporter of this, would be in the long run, I think, benefit a lot to the United States, and this would make the situation a security asset, not a security liability. For the note, I have a perfect track record of making terrible political predictions. In 2008, after a 2-year stay in Jerusalem, I was back in Turkey, and I said, the Arab world will explode. And for me, it's not a whether or not question. For me, it is just when. And my deepest curiosity was which countries will manage it peacefully and which will go into a war against their people. And when the riots began 2 years later, my friend called me, like, how did you know? I didn't know. I didn't project. It isn't that sophisticated, for me at least. All you need to do was to take a 30-minute walk on Jerusalem's Salahuddin Street, looking at these unemployed young people packing the street. And this total disconnect is what is being constantly displayed on TV. Music and football and TV series, this total disconnect with that language and with the reality on the street. It's in speaking of those, especially those big countries in the Middle East, those Muslim majority countries, or specifically those Arab nations, I think one of the greatest investments that our country can do would be to close this deficit, to help people, governments and the people close this deficit, this disconnect.
I'm going to make a couple of hopefully brief points. Number one, as I said earlier, there are sources of pluralism short of liberal democracy in all of these countries. And after 9/11, when I was in the State Department, all kinds of programs were invented. One was called MEPI, and the idea was to help civil society groups in these countries to create a neutral, social, not political, series of associations. Could be in the arts, could be in education, could be in science, could be whatever it was as a focus, but build up civil society as a way to develop forms of pluralism, right, short of trying to persuade these people who weren't ready for it to become liberal Democrats. So we don't do that much anymore. I think it's a shame. From the looks of things in the beginning of this administration, we're going to be doing even less of that. Second short point. It's not so much the presence of the United States in a military or political way in the Middle East. That's not the only influence that the United States and the West in general, what remains of that culturally. We have had over the years interests in the Middle East, keeping the Soviet Union out of the area, keeping the oil flowing, keeping the democracies, the one or two democracies in the Middle East, Turkey and Israel, safe from subversion, Russia, and so forth and so on. We had security interests during the Cold War. After the Cold War, it changed a little bit, but we were still there. We were present. And because of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, we had military footprint all over the place, right? From Diego Garcia and Djibouti, all the way across into the region in Egypt and Jordan. So I think that will be diminished as time passes. I mean, this has been the Obama administration wanted to so-called pivot to Asia. They talked the talk, they didn't walk much of the walk. I don't want to go into why, but the idea was to do less in Europe, make the Europeans do more. Stop the stuff in the Middle East, because we never get it right, almost never get it right. And I think over time, there will be a diminished American official presence, military presence in particular, in a lot of these countries. But that's not, it's the television stuff, it's the movies, right? I mean, if you just watch American movies that are exported to the rest of the world, including the Middle East, the cheapest ones to export are the ones that don't have a lot of dialogue. Because translating the English dialogue into the vernacular of the country, that's very expensive, right? So the movies that have a lot of bang, boom, those are the ones that they love. The Chuck Norris movies and all that kind
Jerry
of stuff.
Springer show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I remember a Peace Corps volunteer was in Indonesia, not in the Arab world. A 7-year-old kid comes up to this woman and says, "Show me your gun." She goes, "What? I don't have a gun." She says, and the little kid says, "Sure you do. Every American does." Right? And in American movies, there are no old people. In American movies, there are very rarely children. I mean, this is stuff that they export. It's the cultural influence, right? Which is a market-based thing, and it's nothing to do with the U.S. government, although it should. That's a lot of what causes the heartburn and the boomerang and because the question that was asked after 9/11 was, why do they hate us? Right? That was the question. Remember that? You old enough to remember that? Why do they hate us? Right? They don't hate us. We discuss them sometimes for reasons that I'm perfectly willing to. But it's not hate. It's alienation and disgust from the way that we project, way that we are projected into their homes. And so it's not. Don't think about it just as military bases and airplanes flying all over the place and CENTCOM in Qatar and things like that. Don't think of it that way. It's a much broader cultural phenomenon that you're really pointing to.
We are just about out of time, but I think in the reception we have with all that Panera food afterwards, Adam and Ibrahim will be here for a few more minutes. If you have further questions, I think they would probably be here for a little bit, and I definitely do, so I will bother you with some stuff. Just a couple of quick promos. Ibrahim, again, is the director of the Raspberry Patch. Sorry, of the Rumi Forum. Adam is the director of the Raspberry Patch. Sorry. Ibrahim is the director of the Rumi Forum. The Rumi Forum is a Hizmet associated institution here around DC that does wonderful events, iftars, and panels, and all sorts of things. They always have really, really, really good food, and they always have very good conversation as well. I always walk out of them feeling very wholesome. I'll actually be working with them to do an event sometime in April with the conservative author Carrie Sheffield on her recent book, The Motorhome Prophecies, on some of these very isolation dynamics in the United States of America. The date for that will be set up sometime soon, but if you follow the Rumi Forum's newsletter, you will get information on that pretty shortly here. Adam Garfinkle runs the one of the most eclectic and fascinating Substacks I subscribe to, and one that really needs to be followed by more people around this town, called The Raspberry Patch, in which he offers commentaries on foreign policy, 1980s cultural tropes, and a very, very comprehensive understanding of what exactly ails American society, from the philosophical premises of the Enlightenment breaking down all the way down to the rewiring of the neurons in our brains due to the rectangular boxes. It's really interesting. I hope it gets published as a book one of these days. It would be very helpful for a lot of things. And it is very worth subscribing to. So Adam can give you directions on how to find the Raspberry Patch on the internet shortly after this. We will be doing more events between the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy and the Eisenhower Institute in the coming months. The remainder of the spring series will feature more of them on religion in public life specifically. On May 5th, we're going to be doing one event with the authors Shadi Hamid and Christine Emba on questions of the different approaches to how American public discourse talks about religion and secularity. You are very invited to that. I'm excited for that conversation as much as I was for this one. And there should be various other ones coming down the pipeline. Stay tuned if you follow the ICRD and Eisenhower Institute newsletters too. Finally, the Eisenhower Institute does a lot of great events. They mostly do student services now, but they're increasingly doing things engaging with the policy community. As you can see, they have a great space and every possible book on the legacy and biography of Dwight Eisenhower you could ever want to read, and a couple more. And they're just wonderful people here in DC doing some wholesome work that I think needs to be done a little bit more. So thank you to the Eisenhower Institute for hosting us as well. Meantime, let me just extend a thank you to all of you for coming here on your evening to discuss a very esoteric and yet very pressing issue that is increasingly relevant in the United States all the way around. As we approach and get closer into not only the 2026 midterms, but this still young 21st century of ours, I am eager to be discussing with these friends of mine and my ICRD colleagues and perhaps some of you over the coming years and decades what exactly is wrong and how we can fix it, or at the very least, how we can manage it in ways that carry the American project and all the other ones that we are working on forward into a new time. With that, let me bring Ray up. Ray, thank you for all that you have done to make this possible, and I'll leave the last word to you.
Yeah, I'm fasting.
I won't keep you much longer, so we can break. But yeah, thank you again for coming. This is one of many, hopefully, in the months to come. Our U.S. domestic work is about diving into these questions of encouraging better questions, better conversations, deeper questions and deeper conversations. A couple of things, that Adam, you pointed out about our approach to violent extremism and radicalization being primarily either therapeutic from the mental health side or police surveillance, kinetic strategies. But those two, I think, approaches treat the individuals as the problems. But I think in the spirit of Hizmet Movement, maybe the question should be, what is wrong with us as a society that we have people who are falling into those dark rabbit holes? What if we take a look at ourselves and how we connect or not connect, and see if we can make space for questions like this and conversations like this and gatherings like this, where we can explore these questions together and create another kind of space for belonging and meaning. So I thank you very much. And yeah, please feel free to take some more food with you on your way out. And yeah, hope to see you guys again. Thank you.
Yeah. It's so much more efficient.
You think you know something about something, you hear someone who, yeah, exactly, who really knows something about something. There were things that does it, no limits. Yeah. There's no limits. Did you work also?
Not in this field.
Okay. Yes. So completely separate from.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I have the chickens.
Okay.
How are you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's your background?
Well, I'm from the region.
Yeah, but some interesting.
Yeah.
How are you? Oh, good.
Has a way of getting away from it.
Yeah, I thought he was, looking out at the audience and a couple comments on it.
A few things I'm not allowed.
Yeah.
I remain as if I'm my
No, that's our.
So, yeah, I was just interested in
You're not gonna like
Yeah. We need more funding.
After you would have thought.
Oh, boy.
You just, yeah. So a little bit of a different perspective.
Absolutely.
feel free to talk about it.
Yeah, so I had a meeting with the talking but pitch them the idea.
I'm actually one of Professor Kim's students in Georgetown. Yeah. Nice to meet you. I need to head out to write one of his papers, and I'm just
A wonderful
I haven't gotten that many grades back, but I would say pretty fair.
now.
Communication. Yeah. It's a really cool organization. Yeah. I've talked a little bit with Professor Kim about it.
The brain, I hope it happens. For sure. Thanks very much again for the
I'm a third year in engineering. I'm undergraduate, not
They didn't have a
graduate.
vision that I saw on their face.
Are you majoring in?
And then they got back to me.
I'm majoring in culture and politics, and then I have a religion, ethics, and world affairs minor, so that's kind of like where this tends to but it's a little hard.
Can you ask Tracy how to connect this back again?
Sorry, no, go for it. You need to head out to write your paper, but thank you so much. Have a good trip to Boston.
It connected here.
Okay.
No farce
This actually,
We had farces.
the single biggest thing coming out of this event for me is
I said it in the office.
I don't know. But there's a lot of people interested.
Same.
Some of the other things.
and it's the single most direct.
Nobody cares.
Out of much more than sociology, much more than